This is Carolina Ghost Towns, a podcast about the vanished towns and lost communities in South Carolina, North Carolina, and maybe a few other places. I'm your host, Tom Taylor. Just a quick production note. Carolina Ghost Towns will be taking a short break for the months of July and August. I'll be back in September with more Carolina and Southern ghost towns. There is a happy land far, far away, where saints in glory stand, bright, bright as day. That's on page 354 of The Sacred Harp, a hymnal published by B.F. White. The text was by Scottish poet Andrew Young and was published in 1838. So much of gospel music is focused on that happy land far, far away, or in the sweet by and by, or over Jordan, or some other imagery of a perfect life in the hereafter. For enslaved African Americans, that desire was more for the here and now than the hereafter. Their gospel traditions leaned more toward a land of freedom rather than just a heavenly kingdom. It was a long path, but it would arrive. The Emancipation Proclamation and the end of the Civil War were the heralds of that new land. However, settling into a new life after slavery was just one of the many, many challenges for newly freed African Americans. In 1865, the U.S. government set up the Freedmen's Bureau, a federal agency to direct, quote, provisions, clothing, and fuel for the immediate and temporary shelter and supply of destitute and suffering refugees, and freedmen and their wives and children, close quote. According to Wikipedia, the day-to-day duties of the Freedmen's Bureau was to help solve everyday problems of the newly freed slaves, such as obtaining food, medical care, communication with family members, and jobs. Between 1865 and 1869, it distributed 15 million rations of food to freed African Americans and 5 million rations to impoverished whites, and set up a system by which planters could borrow rations in order to feed freedmen they employed. This assistance took on different forms in different states. There was a push for better education, the establishment of colleges, and the construction of churches for the African American community. In some cases, the newly freed slaves were granted or purchased large tracts of land to create their own communities. The Port Royal experiment on Hilton Head produced the town of Mitchellville, which we heard about in the last episode. In another episode, the town of Hamburg on the Savannah River became a site of a freedmen community. I've also covered Kingville in this podcast, but there was also Promised Land in Liberia in South Carolina. And in Georgia, there was Chubbtown, Pinpoint, Pinnock, and Oscarville. In North Carolina, you would find Bethania, James City, Princeville, and Roanoke Island. Most of these did not survive as separate towns. Probably one of the most unusual freedmen settlements was the Kingdom of Happy Land, which straddled the border between North and South Carolina.
The land and I am bound for sweet Canaan's happy land. I am bound for sweet Canaan's happy land. I am bound for sweet Canaan's happy land. Pray, give me your right hand. Oh, my brother, did you come for to help me? Oh, my brother, did you come for to help me?
Until recently, most of what we know about the Kingdom of Happy Land comes from an 18-page booklet by Sadie Smathers Patton, written in 1957. I found a copy of it in the Hendersonville County Library. Patton's language is florid, speculative, and her comments on race are uncomfortable to our modern sensibilities. It contains some contradictory statements, such as comments about who was actually in charge in the kingdom. There's been a good bit of research done since then, and now we have a little clearer picture about what life was like in the kingdom. To help me tell the story of Happy Land, I've invited my friend Scott Withrow back to the show. Scott is a local historian and the author of the book, The Superhighway in Upstate South Carolina. Scott and I team-taught a course at Furman on the lost communities of South Carolina, and he taught the portion on the Kingdom of Happy Land.
I am bound for Canaan's happy land. Pray, give me your right hand.
As the Civil War drew to a close, the story goes, emancipated men and women from, some people say Mississippi, the deep South somewhere, were moving north to find a secure place, safety, self-sufficiency. And we don't know how many they were in the caravan, in the group.
Okay.
But most people think around 50 at least. And when they got to the North Carolina, South Carolina line, just near Hendersonville, near present Tuxedo, they were coming up the state road, we think. Sometimes that's called the Buncombe Road. And they came to this stagecoach stop called Oakland. And the person living there was widowed, Serepta Merritt Davis. And the slaves they had there had been emancipated. She needed someone to help, so she was very hospitable and gave the travelers food and a place to stay, and they worked there and in the community in exchange for being able to live there.
Sadie Patton's book says that the Happy Land settlers came from Mississippi. Later research has cast doubt on that idea, saying that the group came from Cross Anchor in Spartanburg County. I was able to find several news articles from the 1870s written by someone calling themselves Carolina Spartan. Given the pseudonym, the writer was evidently from Spartanburg County, providing even more evidence for an origin in the Cross Anchor area. The writer described the group and their journey in rather unflattering and racist language.
We understand from reliable authority that one day last week about 50 Negroes, men, women, and children, passed up the Buncombe Road on their way, as they said, to the Promised Land. It seems that these poor creatures who hailed from the southern portion of this county had been so deluded by a Negro preacher who claimed to be inspired and commissioned to lead them to the Promised Land that they hastily sold everything that they had, including their growing crops, and with their families took up the line of march under the leadership of this self-styled Moses, for the land flowing with milk and honey. This new prophet told them that the land of Canaan was about 160 miles distant, but as far as our informant goes, he failed to locate it exactly. These Zion travelers, as they called themselves, will travel a great ways, we fear, before they find the Paradise Promised Land.
Another contemporary newspaper quoted this and embellished it with outlandish tales of human sacrifice before the Zion travelers started on their journey. Scott told me what he thinks about the settlers' origins. Now, I heard that Some of them, it's been found out, actually came from the Cross Anchor area. Had you done any research or knew anything about that?
I think it might be more likely. I was going to say that later on. There are two or three ideas there. The Bobo family, which was a French Huguenot family, there were lots of enslaved people there in the Cross Anchor, Cross Keys area. One white member of the family took enslaved persons and went to Mississippi.
Okay.
And there is a town named Bobo there. It is possible that the enslaved persons there knew persons still in Cross Anchor, and they came through there on their way further north.
Okay, that makes sense.
To where they settled. But the other idea that I've heard is that following the Civil War, the Klan became very active in southern Spartanburg County and maybe in Union County, and they were fleeing repression by the Klan and did come from Cross Anchor in that area.
Okay.
Because you find names among the inhabitants of Happy Land with the name Bobo. I looked up Montgomery, which is a name you find, and I found Montgomery related to churches in the Innery and Cross Anchor area.
Okay.
So they could have come from that area. Yes.
All right. That makes a lot more sense, being a combination of those two sources.
They didn't have a lot of money. The caravan didn't, or food. We don't think so. Mississippi is quite a trek.
The residents of the Kingdom of Happy Land worked on Serepta Davis's farm, raising crops for food and for sale. Luella Montgomery was the group's leader, referred to as Queen. Her husband, William, was the king. Later, William's brother, Robert, took over that title. Luella was known as a healer, and soon the group was producing a product called Happy Land Liniment, which was sold locally in the Hendersonville area.
And Luella Bobo Montgomery, who was queen of Kingdom of Happy Land, was a healer, perhaps an herbalist. But there was a king and queen. It was based on African traditional culture, probably that the people there had heard about from their ancestors. It was a communal village. Everything was in common. They had a treasurer. Probably the king or queen was treasurer. At one time, the king and queen were husband and wife. There was Robert Montgomery, and then William succeeded him. One was her husband, and one was her brother-in-law, one of the Montgomery men. It is said that she lived in South Carolina, just across the line, and had a cabin there, and that the king lived in a cabin just in North Carolina. They stopped there, I'm sure, because they were invited and because they could work in exchange for staying there. But there might have been a strategic rationale, too, to settle along the state line. Having a problem in one state, they could move over into the other very easily.
Okay.
They did have the communal village, grew crops, especially potatoes, corn. They cleared, and I can talk about some of the work they did too, if you'd like.
Yes, that would be good as well. Thank you.
They certainly grew produce. The women sometimes knitted, wove, worked in the community, and the men also worked in the community. Some of the men, and this is one of the most interesting things to me because I like historic roads and geography, the men worked as teamsters, and they would carry produce in wagons on the old state road or Buncombe Road into Greenville. And I would think if they traveled far enough, and I think they would cross the Poinsett Bridge, the stone bridge, which is still there in Greenville County.
Do you think they could have been drovers along that line, driving the livestock and so forth?
Also drovers, yes, certainly. That was a drover road there too. I have read that people brought chestnuts, the American chestnut, out of the mountains for sale in the Greenville area or further. And I wondered if they ever brought a wagon load or chestnuts down out of the mountains as teamsters.
Okay.
for someone.
Happy Land people also took jobs in Hendersonville and the surrounding area as cleaners, blacksmiths, and other trades. It was also said that they, quote, squeezed a little corn, close quote, to make some moonshine, which was also sold locally. Education, which had been denied to blacks during slavery, became an important part of the community. An article on the Flat Rock Together blog describes William and Luella's role in promoting education. Quote, both William and Luella were taught to read and write and served as teachers and priests for the kingdom. In addition to teaching the children their school lessons, Luella trained them in hymns, spirituals, and other songs. Oral tradition recalls the Kingdom Singers, organized by Queen Luella, performing musical programs each summer in the surrounding communities. One story tells of an elderly lady sitting on her porch, snapping beans, as a group from the kingdom came up the road singing gospel songs. Long before she could see them, she thought the angels were announcing the rapture. Close quote. In addition to the original settlers, newcomers learned about the kingdom and traveled to North Carolina to join them. There were active efforts to recruit new members. One Reverend Ezel Couch was brought to the kingdom as a young child from Union, South Carolina in 1873, and as an adult went out as a kind of missionary to entice other African Americans from South Carolina to join the group. This year, a new novel came out about the Kingdom of Happy Land that gives a pretty good idea of what life was like in the settlement. Happy Land by Dolen Perkins-Valdez is a work of historical fiction, but the author has done extensive research into the community. Perkins-Valdez was recently interviewed by NPR's Michelle Martin about the novel.
They called themselves royalty. They called themselves a king and a queen, and that part of it was what ignited my imagination.
Tell us about the story that you tell in your novel.
I decided, first thing I want to do is correct some of the things that have been assumed to be true for over, 60 years. And then the second thing I wanted to do was to ask myself and to ask my reader, what did it mean for these people to be property owners in North Carolina in the 1870s and 1880s? What did it mean both symbolically, metaphorically, spiritually, emotionally? What did it mean for them?
In the novel, the contemporary narrator, Nikki, learns that she's a descendant of Luella Montgomery. The story alternates between the contemporary and historical tales of the kingdom. I found it to be an engrossing novel, and even though it's a work of fiction, it gave me a sense of how the kingdom life had been. The Kingdom of Happy Land lasted until the early 1900s. When the railroad was completed up the Saluda grade to Asheville, the Buncombe Road became less important. The teams of drovers were no longer needed, and travelers didn't stop at the Davis house for food or lodging. The original settlers died off, and the younger members of the group left to seek jobs elsewhere.
It was when the railroad had already come through at that time, and there was not as much need for some of the work as teamsters, and there were other reasons perhaps that the Happy Land dissolved, and eventually people moved away for other jobs.
Okay, so there was the coming of the railroad. What were some of those other reasons that you had heard for the dissolution of the community?
I've also heard pressure from the Klan, from the community some way, but I've also heard that there were jobs that opened up in communities, but people moved to Flat Rock. I'm sure Hendersonville, I'm sure Asheville. There's some stories of people moving into Spartanburg County, North Spartanburg County,
Okay.
and perhaps again to the Cross Anchor area. I'm not sure.
Okay. In the early 1900s, the former settlement lands were sold for non-payment of taxes. Jerry Casey, the last resident of the kingdom, died in 1918. The land was purchased by Joseph Bell, who established the camps in the Tuxedo area on Lake Summit. Now, there's not much left of the original kingdom. There was an old cabin once thought to be the palace for Queen Luella, according to Patton. It was rumored that gold had been stashed in the chinks and crevices of the old palace cabin. The Bell family eventually dismantled the remaining chimneys and structures to thwart treasure hunters seeking the gold. Scott Withrow had visited the site some years ago and described what one might find on the kingdom land.
Sadie Smathers Patton in 1957 did the first booklet, and she got information, firsthand information from some of the descendants. But she made some mistakes. She didn't have it was before computers, and she couldn't do computer research and collaborate that way. If there's a mistake, it tends to get repeated on computers. But she did say that there was a cabin in Happy Land that was still standing. I've seen the cabin, but it was a later built cabin. It doesn't go back to that era. Also, we think that the people in Happy Land were given cabins that had formerly belonged to enslaved people there. Some of those cabins in the early 20th century sometimes were demolished, were torn down. Understand that if you go there in the spring, you might see periwinkle or daffodil, or I think there's some evidence perhaps of some potato cellars or more springs. And there's a chimney left, remains of a chimney. It's private property, and I understand that people have taken stones, however. There was a story of gold being buried there, whether that's true or not, but that led to some destruction of the chimney. You were asking about where did people go after, or I talked about that, where people went, Flat Rock, Hendersonville, some to Spartanburg County. But back during that time, there were some very small African-American Methodist churches. And there is one Methodist church. It is now called Scenic Hills Baptist Church. It's near the North Fork Reservoir, just off of Old Highway 25. It was the old Mount Carmel Methodist Church.
Okay. And
we're pretty sure that people from Happy Land are buried there at Mount Carmel.
Oh.
And, they could even have, I don't know if they would have established it or not, but that is relatively close. And so there is a connection to that church, Mount Carmel, which is now Scenic Hills.
Okay, I may have to pay that place a visit. Well, once again, Scott, thank you so much for giving us this information on the Kingdom of Happy Land. One of the major products of the Kingdom of Happy Land was the Happy Land Liniment, mentioned earlier. Salim Hugh Penny is a black rural hip-hop blues poet, arts educator, and mutual aid advocate with low country roots, according to his website. Leamy, as he's known by his family, tried to replicate the Happy Land liniment by studying the botany of the area along with African traditions of healing. Quote, "Throughout the process of reimagining the Happy Land liniment, I utilize traditional linear research methods, that is, literature reviews, quantitative measures, while also valuing multidirectional migratory memory, such as field notes of traditional root healers, retrospective case studies. I began developing a guiding framework for reimagining the liniment ingredients. First and foremost, the liniment ingredients should target symptoms of rheumatism, a term traditionally used to encompass a range of inflammatory conditions affecting joints and leading to pain, stiffness, and difficulty in movements. Secondly, I only considered ecologically plausible ingredients. Essentially, plants must grow at the specific kingdom site, present-day Zirconia, North Carolina. Close quote. Penny provided several possible recipes for the liniment. The results of his research are documented on his website, interspersed with his poetry. I'll provide a link to his site in the show notes. Given this tradition of healing, it seems only fitting that much of the kingdom land is now owned by Kingdom Harvest. The land was purchased in 2017 and is used to grow hemp for the production of CBD and THC products. Kingdom Harvest's website describes this close connection between their products and the history of Happy Land's liniment. That does it for this week. Next time, we'll look at another happy settlement in South Carolina, one quite different from the Kingdom of Happy Land. Until then, please tell your friends about us and be sure to rate and review the show. Thank you for listening.
In this southern ghost town, we found a story untold. In the shadows of the past, we unravel, secrets unfold. With each step we take, we journey back in time. In this southern ghost town, we leave our footprints behind.
Thanks for listening. The opening music was composed by Lex FM with additional music from Pixabay. The song Southern Ghost Town was generated by Suno AI. All other music was composed and recorded by me, Tom Taylor. Carolina Ghost Towns is a part of the Random Connections empire. It's pretty much a one-man show, so I wear all the hats, including producer, writer, researcher, sound engineer, publicist, and bartender. If you like the show, please subscribe on your favorite pod venue and be sure to give us feedback. If you have questions, comments, or ideas for the show, you can reach me at carolinaghosttownspod@gmail.com. For more information and show notes, visit randomconnections.com. Thank you.
In this southern ghost town, we found a story untold. In the shadows of the past, we unravel, secrets unfold. With each step we take, we journey back in time. In this southern ghost town, we leave our footprints behind.